Good evening and welcome to our public panel on Colombia's political and economic outlook. I want to not only welcome all of you, but we are webcasting this globally, and our webcasts have really begun to attract quite a number of people, not just from the New York area, but throughout Latin America, and interestingly enough, from Europe, the Middle East, Asia as well. So we're really excited about that. And of course, I want to thank our webcast sponsor, which is Telefonica. Tonight, we are very pleased to have the Colombian ambassador to the United States, an old friend, Luis Carlos Villegas, y su señora, con nosotros esta noche, as well as other panelists, Cynthia Arnson, hi Cynthia, from the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, and Erich Arispe from Fitch Ratings. And of course, our own Adriana Rotta, who just returned with me from Brazil, where we had our Latin American Cities Conference in Brazil this week, is going to moderate the discussion, and we're very much looking forward to this discussion. It is very timely with the results of the recent parliamentary elections, the upcoming presidential election, the peace talks, and the status of the world economy. There's really no better time for this panel. And many of us who follow Colombia closely believe that this is a really critical and important and exciting year for the country. So we're really pleased to have this diverse group of experts discussing it. The way we're going to run it is that Ambassador Villegas is going to give some keynote remarks, and then Adriana will chair the panel, and I'm sure she's going to have a number of very lively questions. So with that, Mr. Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you. I'll do that from the podium. That's one of the privileges of big people. Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you very much, Cindy, and my fellows from the panel. I'm so glad to see also Adriana that I saw in Hong Kong the last time. So it's very useful for Colombian interest to have you closer than Hong Kong. I'm very excited and honored to be in this house again. Susan, the first time I came here was, remember that with Susan Seal, was around 93. 93 gives me the chance, the excuse to put that point of reference in time to see what has changed since 93 in Colombia or in the relationship between Colombia and the United States. I remember that those days I came as a guest in the visitors program of the government. And of course we were in the middle of the drug war. We were in the middle of the discussion of a new constitution. We were in the middle of a negotiation with the M19. We were in the middle of a big controversy with Venezuela. We were in the middle of a boom of exports in Latin America. And we were starting to have bad times in the bilateral relationship with the United States due to the war against drugs. When I take a look at the figures, I think it's useful for an audience, a distinguished audience like this one, to see that in comparison. We had an economy that was for around 90 billion US dollars of GDP in 2000, starting this century. Last year, we closed with 400 billion US dollars. It means that the income of Colombians has moved up from $2,500 to $9,500. And that's a huge change in every single aspect of our lives in that country. It goes from a supply shock, or a demand shock, if you want, on infrastructure, services, politics, security, territory, natural resources, education, health. It goes also to a certain tendency of people that come out from poverty that is legitimate. That is, I don't want to go back to poverty. So I have to stand in front of the government and say, you have to do everything not to let me go back to poverty. And my kids have to have education with quality, and the health coverage has to be improved, and the security in my neighborhood has to be better. But I have also the right to give an opinion on the local proposals of my mayor. And I would like to participate more on the way schools are ruled and run. So it's a big change once you have people that have moved from poverty to middle classes. I give some figures that I think are illustrative of what has happened. For instance, we had 6 million air passengers in 2006. We closed last year with 28 million air passengers. Rich people in Colombia cannot fly that frequently. Someone else has to be buying the tickets. People that have reached an income that allow them to go to Cali with their family, or to Cartagena, or to Santa Marta. We moved from 60% of poverty to 30% of poverty. That's the last figure we had 2 weeks ago. It means that almost 1 million Colombians per year have moved from poverty to the middle classes in the last decade and 12 years. It gives also the very appropriate impression that we have opened our society in two main fields. One, economy. Our trade moved from $30 billion to $120 billion. But also, we opened our country to international scrutiny. That was not so in the 60s, 70s, and half of the 80s. And every single activity in Colombia has an international monitor, if you take a look at the list. In politics, in elections, in territorial decisions, in foreign policy, in military affairs, security affairs, police affairs, judiciary affairs, there is an international eye taking a look. Sometimes, most of them, very generously and with the aim of constructing, sometimes with less generosity and with ideology inside. But it has permitted our society to move to the currents of thought, to the currents of trade, to the currents of investment in a way we had never been able to do yet in a century and a half. We have also good news for investors. Our economy has reached a point very close to 30% of GDP in investment. We closed something like 28 or 29%. That's Asian numbers, Asian figures. That's what has permitted the Asian tigers to grow at more than 5% for 2 decades. It's having 30% of GDP in investment. It has happened in Colombia year after year in the last 6 or 7 years. So the future is bright for that. I think the panel will take care of that question. What's going to happen in this 14 and what's going to happen in the other years of the future? But my guess is that Latin America is going to have another economy, a third economy of more than $500 billion of GDP in the next 4 to 5 years, and that's Colombia. We are able to grow at 5%. We did it last year. Last quarter was 4.9. The forecast for this year is 5. And we haven't added yet to that figure the big investment we are making in infrastructure. As we speak, bids are open for public works for $26 billion. On roads that will communicate the center of the Coffee Belt with the Caribbean coast, or the east near the frontier of Venezuela with the Pacific Ocean, being that Urabá or Buenaventura. That's going to be also a big change for Colombia. Our challenge has been historically our topography, our geography. That is crazy. You have to move from the sea level to 3,000 meters, then to 400 meters, then to 3,500 meters, then to 400 again, and then to 3,000 again to go to Bogotá from Cali in a road that is 450 kilometers. So now we are making the investment to make the tunnels, the viaducts, things that we could never do because we have a state that has the muscle to do that. We couldn't do that in the 19th century, we couldn't do that in the beginning of the 20th century. But now that we have discovered more oil, more coal, we have an income from mining and energy that was never present in our budget. We have been able to invest in infrastructure, but also to make a big, big change in the social policies. Moving, as I said, from 60% to 13% poverty is something proportionally of the same size that has been done by Brazil or by China if you compare to their population. We've also got to the point of having universal health coverage, thing that, as we speak, has not been a reality in this country yet. We have universal coverage. The discussion in Colombia is not if someone has an insurance for health. No, it's if he has the right for implants, static surgery, teeth surgery, and so on. The quality of the services the patient receives is the discussion, not if he has the right or not to receive them. We also moved in education to basic universal coverage, medium universal coverage, and we doubled the capacity of our universities and technological schools to receive young people. The proof is that we are seeing the Colombians going back to Colombia after we were exporters of our population and we got to a point of having 10% of our population outside of the country. We are seeing that families are going back to Colombia with their young people, second, third generation of Colombians are going back. They think they can handle a new business, small or medium. They think they can have a university or good education for their kids, and so on. So we're seeing the contrary of what we lived for 25 years in questions of immigration. So I could go on with this good news for a long run, but what is necessary to be asked is what's necessary to do to become a developed country, I would put it that way. Colombia has decided to become a developed country in the next generation of Colombians. What has to be done? And the answer, yes, of course, we are far from perfect, far. What we have done is positive, is the fruit of the hard work of many Colombians, even with the sacrifice of their own lives. We have also had the very timely and generous cooperation of the United States of America with Plan Colombia in the start of the century that has been very efficient, and our free trade agreement. But we need to do more. What's that? First, a big reform and overhaul of justice. The reform of justice is necessary in Colombia. President Santos has said that if I'm reelected, the first thing we have to do is an overhaul of our judiciary from top to bottom, to make it closer to the citizen, to make it faster for the investor, to make it more transparent for regions that have never had a justice administration close to them. It's going to be hard. It will take a lot of political capital, but it's necessary, absolutely. Second, we have to move permanently in reforms of regulation, of markets, of the necessary investment to make more equal our society, continue the trend of lowering poverty to levels of 10 or 12% in the next 10 to 15 years. And third, we have to end what is left of our conflict. There are still some regions in Colombia where we have an armed conflict, where the protagonists are FARC or ELN, or the criminal bands, or just organized crime. We have moved in a very positive direction in illicit crops, for instance. We used to have 200,000 hectares of coca. Now we have 30,000 hectares. That's still a lot, but the trend is practically going vertically down. But it's the fuel of some regions as far as the conflict is concerned. We need to eradicate illicit crops. We need to fight organized crime in a more independent way from other sources of violence and from crime. That's independently from FARC and ELN that have political ingredients still. We have to be able to fight against organized crime without those political ingredients that don't let us really get the results we could have with the public force we have, even the military or the police. So President Santos, and with this I close to open the panel if you want, decided to open negotiations to end the conflict with FARC. Why he took that decision? For three major reasons. First, because the military balance is in the favor of the government, of the state. It was not so in '84, it was not so in 2000. Second, because the international community has realized that the support has to be given to the Colombian state, not to the parties that are negotiating, as happened in 2000 in Caguán or in '84 in the Betancourt administration. We were treated as equals, FARC and the Colombian state. Now it's not so. The international support is to the government of President Santos that is trying to negotiate peace with FARC. That's subtle, but makes a big difference. And third, because we have another state to present to FARC in the table. That is, that we had a budget of $25 billion in Caguán. That was the budget of the Republic of Colombia, 25 billion or 30. This year's budget is $115 billion. It means that you can deal with the agenda that we had abandoned for 200 years. Land restitution, displacement, land titles, land taxation, and of course the reforms of justice and of politics as we have done in the last 3.5 years. So it's a bigger, stronger state that faces the old items of the Colombian historic agenda with success, and that is militarily strong. That's what FARC found at that table at Havana, where I remained for almost 14 months. I'm still following the negotiations from here, but what they found was another Colombia, a new Colombia. And they have a very big difficulty to change their minds at the same pace as the Colombia change took place. So this is the story. We have a lot of things to do ahead. We have good political leadership. We have good political institutions, strong. We have a sound economy, sound economic institutions. We have a society that paid the highest price to become a more secure society, get rid of most of the organized crime that was threatening our existence. And we have the best relationship with the United States in our history. We have changed our agenda from drugs to science, from military cooperation to education, from police training to non-conventional hydrocarbons exploration. And that's big for the Colombian history. I've been coming to Washington, the US, for 38 years, out of which 35 were to give an explanation about something. Now I feel that every time I meet someone or go to an institution, there is a positive comment about Colombia. There is a reference to something we did well that should be done by others. And that of sitting and talk about others, it's a pleasure I have never felt. So thank you very much for this invitation, and let's move to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Villegas, for your comments. I think you left us with very little to discuss after that remarks. I'm kidding. Good evening, everybody. My name is Adriana Rotta. As Susan said, I'm Media Relations Director here at America Society and the Council of the Americas, and my background is journalism. But don't worry that I will behave tonight. But I'm really very pleased and feel honored to be here, to be able to sit here to ask questions about a country that means a lot to me, and I'm sure it means also a lot to you because you are here, and it's because it happens to be my own country. As Ambassador said, I don't need to tell anyone here that this is a crucial moment for Colombia, and if I may, I would say that it's a moment of hope like I personally cannot remember. As President Santos said last September before the United Nations General Assembly, the current generation of Colombians has not seen a single day of peace. And that's easy to say, but it's very harsh to live when you look at your past and you really have not seen peace in your life. So that's the measure of how important this year is for Colombia. And there are other things apart from the peace process that are positive. As the Ambassador said, the economy is going pretty well. There are some things that I'm sure Erich will point out to that are not so bright. We just had congressional elections, May 25th presidential elections. If there is a need for a runoff, that will happen in June. So this is a really timely moment to host an event like this, and we are very privileged to have a wonderful group of panelists, to have, of course, the Ambassador, who previously was the head of the National Business Association of Colombia for over 17 years, so he really has a public-private sector background like very few. We have also Dr. Cynthia Arnson, Director of the Latin American Program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Cynthia has been traveling to Colombia for over 20 years. She has authored scores of publications, not just on Colombia, but also Venezuela, Argentina, Central America. And you also have 2 books on peace processes. So it's good that you have, I imagine, a big picture, but also the details, the nuance of these processes, and that's something that we are going to discuss tonight. And we have Erich Arispe, Director in Fitch Ratings Sovereigns Group, where he covers Colombia among other countries. And Erich is a renowned analyst, and he is very insightful. And as you will see, he has a gift for translating topics that are usually very hard to understand for a general audience. So it's very good to have him here as well. I have many questions, but I really hope that we can, as Susan suggested, have a lively dialogue. So feel free to weigh in and jump in and interrupt and contradict, so we can make this enjoyable for the audience. I would like to start with Erich about the economy. That's something that the Ambassador mentioned extensively. In December, you upgraded the rating of Colombia to a BBB. So I would like to know the reasons why that happened. What do you expect that is going to happen for this year, maybe next year? And also, how do you connect what is happening in Colombia to what is happening in other emerging markets? Because what we are seeing is really volatility, but maybe not all countries have to be measured the same way.
Correct. Well, thank you very much to the Council of the Americas for the invitation. and of course an honor to be part of this panel and discuss Colombia in such an important year. I think that it's very telling to be speaking about, from the economic point of view, how fast is going to grow Colombia in 2014, or how much the economy is going to accelerate. While we are hearing in the rest of the world the issues regarding volatility, always economists come up with groupings of countries like the Fragile Five. So to know that Colombia somehow has been isolated, or at least is not suffering the direct impact of this increased market volatility, should give some credence to the strength of the policy framework. And probably that's one of the main elements that we took into account when we upgraded Colombia to its current level of BBB. The other element that we took into account is how resistant or how strong has Colombia become in order to absorb external shocks, such as the present or one related to a drop in commodity prices. We believe that not only the policy flexibility that Colombia has in terms of exchange rate that can adjust and take the brunt, you can let the currency depreciate by 9-10% and not suffer the negative consequences such as financial instability or higher inflation. That's a difference with other emerging markets that we have seen that have to defend a certain level of the currency in order to avoid these negative effects. Colombia has that because of the credibility, because of the absence of financial dollarization in the local financial system, and also a credit to the policy making of Colombia, not only this year or last year, but a consistency over the past decade. I think that what Colombia has produced is a policy framework that evolves through time and looks at the conditions that were becoming sort of permanent, this quantitative easing, the access to easy financing in the world, took the measures to avoid this to filtering into the economy, really, and making the economy more able to respond to the withdrawal of liquidity without risking financial or macroeconomic instability. So, and the final point is that the policy of accumulation of international reserves of the central bank. It's of course a very controversial subject, the issue of the currency, not only in Colombia but also in the rest of Latin America, when we have this wall of money supposedly coming to our way. In the policy that the central bank took of accumulating reserves, it has a cost, certainly, but I guess that cost is justified. It's an insurance policy when you see actually that financial volatility conditions can change and probably would remain very fragile at the global level. So you have some insurance that allows you to, if necessary, intervene and provide external liquidity to the economy. So I would say that in that respect, we believe that credit fundamentals in Colombia are stronger, as well poised to navigate this turbulence this year. And regarding the perspective of the economy, I think that, as I said, it's a good sign when you're debating how fast the economy is going to grow in 2014. And our own forecast is 4.6. Slight acceleration this year, and we believe that this should be good news for Colombia. If you take the weighted average of Latin America is growing at 2.5, so Colombia is growing. And if you take how much countries with a similar rating than Colombia are growing, probably it's even lower, it's around 3. That's good news. However, the challenge for Colombia is to start the other engines of growth in the economy. And one of the important developments that possibly is going to materialize over the next couple of years is this infrastructure program that serves two purposes, provide a stimulus in the short term to the economy, but also improve the competitiveness. And probably we can talk later more specifically about that, but I think that's key for all economies in Latin America, because one thing we know for sure, and is that commodity price increases are not going to repeat the cycle 2003-2012. So we're going to see stability in the base case scenario, and therefore the countries have to try to find some way to make their economies more competitive and find some local engines of growth.
So you say 4.6, Ambassador says 5. Last year, I think there is one sector that is really not growing as it should, that is the industrial sector, and you have that background. So.
Well, yes. Let me make one comment of what Erich has said. If you asked me what's one single reason of Colombian economic stability, I would say fiscal policy. It's very rare in the developing world that politicians take the decision of fiscal rules and fiscal responsibility in the middle of enlarging the fiscal income. But when it's the contrary, everybody takes the decision easily. But when you're having income that is growing at a very fast pace, the trend of politics is not to accept fiscal rules, to spend more. We took the decision in the middle of growth of fiscal income, and we have both the fiscal rule that impeaches governments, this or the future governments, to spend more than a certain percentage of GDP with certain conditions, so deficit cannot grow, and fiscal responsibility in a way that no authority from the legislative, the government, or the judiciary can take decisions that are not backed by a fiscal budget. So I would say that's the reason why we're different. So in growth, yes, I think we can deal with 5, I would say even easily, in the way that in that 5% is not included the percentage, additional percentage of infrastructure contribution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, can I jump in with something?
Yeah,
One thing that really strikes me, and I am again thankful to you and to Susan for this wonderful invitation, and delighted to be with Ambassador Villegas and other people on this panel. One of the things I find so striking, in contrast to the very optimistic picture of growth and poverty reduction, and all of those things are true, is the overall level of pessimism in the country. And you can't always trust any particular poll, but there was a recent Gallup poll that came out in mid-March of this year, just a few weeks ago, that showed that the majority of Colombians think that the country is going va por mal camino, it's going in a bad direction, and the number of people who are concerned about issues like unemployment or the quality of services has gone up over the last 6 months. So you have this great disparity between the economic numbers and the expectations of common people. I'm not sure how Colombia compares with other countries in that regard, but I do think it's quite remarkable.
I think maybe we just came from Brazil this week, and we observe exactly the same case. So
although Brazil is in a very different moment economically.
Yeah,
Brazil really
absolutely.
is absolutely seeing a deceleration from something like 7 or 8% growth a year down into the 1 to 2%. You know.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's it's quite dramatic, and I think there's a real foundation. Whereas Colombia, the attitudes persist even while the economy is doing so well, and this is obviously an electoral year, and those kinds of perceptions and expectations play a very important role in terms of deciding whether or not to stay the course or to make a change or whatever.
But could it be, Erich, just a matter of perceptions?
I think it's a very important point in the fact that, from our narrow perspective as a rating agency, we have to concentrate on capacity and willingness to pay. And clearly Colombia has strengthened that in recent years. Now, if you look at perception, we have seen this in other countries, such as Peru, which you can arguably say giving high growth rates, and the performance on the economy has been among the top in the region. And sometimes has to do with how much does it trickle down to the local level, beyond the major cities, beyond the activities that are driving the economic expansion. And I would say it takes some time, both for the state to build the capability to be able to deliver the opportunities that growth is bringing along. In Peru, this is one of the key challenges for policymakers. How to make more Peruvians, especially those Peruvians living in the highlands or far away from like medium cities, feel that the growth is benefiting them. And that goes in line, of course, with convincing them that the model that Peru has undertaken in terms of economic policy is the correct one to benefit most of them. It takes time. Concerns at certain points in time that have to do with political events may also drive negative expectations. In Peru, that's driven, you can arguably say that Peru's challenges in terms of security are not as great as Colombia's embarking in peace negotiations, but pessimists tend to rise when there are shocks to confidence because of the inherent nature of distrust that some people may have against the government of President Ollanta, which, as you know, came from a different direction before taking the presidency. So I would say that perceptions can differ, and over the medium to long term, only the consistency in delivering a growth performance and at the same time developing the channels for people to take part is the correct option. I think the government has tackled the challenge of employment, for instance, which is one of the concerns still present in Colombia. And I would say that the reform that they undertook in 2012, reducing the cost for people to employ, is a positive step. There's much to be done, but I think that Colombia is trying to tackle those challenges already.
Yeah. I think Cynthia's point is very valid because perceptions are important, and because people's perceptions and people vote. Mm-hmm. So it really has a real impact. It's not just people may be, from our point of view, seeing things maybe worse than they are. We don't know, but anyway, it's their view. So I think that allows us to go a little bit towards the politics in the country. I know you have boundaries on what you can comment in terms of politics, but it would be useful for us
Do I have boundaries?
No? Okay, I'm happy if you don't. So if we just had congressional elections, there were changes. There is the new force led by President Uribe, who won almost 30 seats among the two houses. So those perceptions probably were guiding the vote and gave those results. So can you explain us what happened?
Let's take the excuse of Cindy's argument and pessimism to go in that direction. I think we have a mixture of things. One of them is at some stage of our history in the last 40 years, Colombians as a collective entity, we lost our self-esteem. Those were the times where in airports you saw a bunch of people with their passports covered by a leather thing so as no one knew that was a Colombian passport. Those were the times where we had 4 million people living outside. Those were the times where you had a big terrorist attack or a big attack of the mob and the mafia in the main cities of Colombia. So we thought that everything was lost for us, that it was impossible to come back. And even if we worked hard to come back, we're not still convinced that we did it. I find this very clearly when I do these trips to the Colombian consulates and visit the Colombian communities. I have done 5 so far. They know that change has appeared in Colombia, but they don't think that the change is so bright and so tangible. So I think in that respect, what is lacking is a big campaign of the good news on Colombia internally. I think there's a better perception, and I agree with you, outside of what we have achieved than internally. The second thing is that we are in the middle of a peace negotiation, and that affects also the perception of people. The polls show that when you ask Colombians, do you trust FARC? The answer is 78% no. When you ask in the next line, so would you like the Colombian government to step up from the table and abandon negotiations? The answer is no, 69%. So it's that mixture also that I think is very influential in what people feel about pessimism or optimism. And finally, there is one thing that, Cindy, you that have so good papers and studies on Latin America and Colombia. What I feel is that success in the fight against corruption brings perception on corruption to the worst place you ever can think of. What I mean by that? I heard once President Carter saying that countries that don't have scandals of corruption are countries where corruption works very comfortably. We have had in Colombia successes against corruption in the capital, in the city, Bogota. We have had successes against corruption in the military. in the judiciary, in the Congress. We are the only country in the emerging markets that has done twice a cleaning of the Congress in 15 years. Who else has done that? Or is that all the senators and House members in all the rest of the world are angels? No, there's no judge that can send them to jail. In Colombia, we have done that twice. So what's the headlines of these people from the press? Corruption scandal in Congress. Of course it affects your feelings about what is going on. Corruption in the military. Those countries that don't have corruption scandals is where the corruption works very comfortably. And I think that affects also the perception of our citizens.
Okay, I see that the ambassador didn't want to answer my questions on the
on politics.
on
No, but it was too
on
long.
on
I
the
was too
Congress.
long.
Like
I'll go there, I promise.
it's a different Congress. So I think I'm going to jump to
I'll go
Cynthia
back to that, I promise.
to tell us what happened, how the Congress in Colombia looks like now.
Sure. Well, it's obviously, I mean, I think the most notable change that made all of the, headlines here in this country, not headlines at least, was mentioned, was the election of former President Uribe to the Senate. Just a terrible, outspoken, constant critic of President Santos. I think he would put any 25-year-old to shame in terms of how actively he uses his Twitter account to denounce, this or that other phenomenon. But his movement, his new movement, gained 19 seats, about the same as the Conservative Party, and way less than the coalition of parties that support President Santos, which includes the Partido de la U, the Cambio Radical, the Liberal Party. So there are about 47 seats that they hold, and then the Polo, the smaller parties, something like 5 each. I think actually one thing that will be very interesting to see is what happens to the Polo support for President Santos, even in the peace process, as a result of the decisions that have been made about the destitution of the mayor of Bogotá, Gustavo Petro. So I think it's certainly going to make things more difficult in terms of the implementing legislation from the peace process, but it's not by any means a knockout blow. I think that ultimately the kinds of legislation that are presented to the Congress will prevail. But I would agree with Ambassador Villegas that public opinion in Colombia on a whole host of issues related to the peace process, whether or not the FARC should be allowed to form a political party, whether or not they should be able to avoid significant jail time in exchange for confessing their crimes, which was precisely the deal that was offered to the AUC. I mean, there's just terribly negative opinion on all of those issues. Would you be happy if your child was friends with someone who was a former member of the guerrillas? Absolutely not. So there's going to be a very difficult climate in which the Congress will have to reflect the broader currents in Colombian society, which are extremely negative towards questions of FARC political participation. And I'll just end by saying that the whole sort of purpose of a peace process in Colombia, but anywhere in the country, is to get conflict out of the military arena and into the political arena. And if you have the majority of people, or vast numbers of people, who believe that having been a member of the FARC by its very nature should disqualify you from participating, then you're going to have a very difficult scenario in going into the post-Accord era.
Yeah. Erich, it's again on the Congress. Does it change your analysis from back in December when you upgraded Colombia, when you see what the new forces are, the new, the Centro Democrático gaining force, the Green Alliance, voting a candidate that may or may not become a real competitor for President Santos?
Correct. One of the paradoxes as an outside observer of Colombia is that if you look at how Colombia compares in terms of institutions measured by the World Bank governance indicators, it's weak, especially compared to an investment-grade country. However, if you look at the track record in terms of economic policy that Colombia has developed over the past 2 decades, it seems that economic policy has been done in a responsible and consistent way independent of the political cycle, independent of economic crisis, independent of the spike in violence of the conflict. So I guess that the track record speaks for themselves. I think there's a consensus, especially among the political and economic elite of the country, that the direction of economic policies should be maintained. Yes, we would expect to hear some noise. We would see how the government, what strategy do they use in order to pass reforms if necessary. I mean, in the event of the peace process, probably a reform to increase revenues for the government will be also pertaining. Will be difficult subjects to discuss, but I think that in terms of the policies that have made Colombia investment great, we don't see any change from this.
Okay.
I have found extremely hard in some circles in Washington, especially those that don't know much about Colombia, to explain that Santos' government and Uribe's opposition. What? So what you can read out of the elections for Congress is that the Colombian politics moved to the right a little because the new senators come mostly from the left. It was Uribe that took from the left some senators from Polo, from Mira, from PIN, and then some from the traditional parties. But it doesn't affect the majorities of Santos in Congress for legislation. So for the presidential election, we're going to see a complete different scenario. Is that you're going to have a strong president with 33% of vote intention as we speak, and with Mr. Uribe's candidates very far down in 6-7%. Those are my boundaries. I cannot go further than that. But those are the figures that currently we are reading in Colombia. There will be no surprise if, in the future government of President Santos, there could be two kinds of majorities in Congress. One for the daily politics and one for peace, which could include people like the Polo or things like that.
Which is it's important because, as Cynthia mentioned, there is legislation that will be a result of the peace process that will need to be implemented.
Yeah, and hard issues. In Havana, the hardest things are ahead of us.
Yeah.
Justice, starting by that, is. But Santos has said something that I think is very clear. You have to find in Havana a package of peace. If you offer to the public opinion in Colombia one piece at the time, the answer will be no to every single item. But if you reach a package where you can build a program for rural development that is attractive, where you can agree on political reforms that are attractive, where you can have a certain amount of justice that will be delivered, with good treatment to the victims, recognition, reparation, non-repetition, and so on, with verifiable disarmament and the ratification process through popular vote, that's a package acceptable for Colombians and for the international community, even if the standards are today much higher than they were when we were negotiating with M19 or the first negotiation with FARC 20 years ago.
Do you agree?
Sure. I think by the very same logic, that's why the White House, not just this president, but any president, never wants to give up fast-track authority on trade agreements, because you either take the whole thing, or if you start to pick it apart, it would never happen. And I would say that I am modestly optimistic that a referendum would pass, but I think it's going to be a very, very hard sell. And the only way that it's going to pass is as a package deal. If you remember, the referendum around the Guatemalan peace process failed, precisely because it was divided into many different pieces. So I think that there will be general support, but again, I mean, within the country, we all know the importance of the peace process over the long term for the growth of the economy, for the resolution of this thing that really is kind of a relic of the Cold War past. But we also see that if you sort of subdivide public opinion, the peace process and the guerrillas are just really way down on the list of popular concerns. At the top of the list, as it is for most countries in Latin America, unemployment, and then access to health care, and then education. And those things come together to about 60% of what people are, most concerned about. And the guerrillas and the peace process is down in the sort of 6 point something %. So even though it's an issue that will define the future of Colombia and has attracted a great deal of attention in the international community, it ranks way down there, which could help explain some of the negativity of the overall perceptions. And I would just pick up on something that was said earlier, that even though the numbers of poverty have gone way down, we also know, because of a very important World Bank study last year, that the number of people who are in this category of vulnerable, no longer poor, but not yet really middle class, and someone gets sick, that are within a paycheck, if they have a paycheck, at great risk of falling back into poverty. The levels of informality in Colombia are still extremely high. If I'm not mistaken, the majority of the workforce is in the informal sector.
No,
and I would agree.
The last figures showed for the first time that we have the
that it's
majority
gotten better.
informal. Yeah.
And I would also just agree that an aspect of the 2012 tax reform, which was designed to make it easier to hire people in the formal sector, was a very important step forward. So
And the labor annex to the FTA.
Right.
We can't remember that.
Exactly.
It was very efficient.
Exactly. In
helping
terms of
formalization of the labor market.
Yeah. How about, Erich, for the markets, still on the peace process? Because the surge in investment in Colombia was a result of improved security.
Mm-hmm.
That's a fact. So to what extent the confidence of the investors will be there if Colombia actually sign the peace process? Is that really, we know, I guess we agree that it's very important in the long term, even if the population is pessimistic and don't see it so clearly. But what about outside for the markets and for investors?
Well, from a rating perspective, I would say that there would be no immediate benefits from the successful conclusion of a peace process. And let me go back a little bit in history. When Colombia was investment grade at the beginning of the 2000s, or the beginning of the new century, right? And it lost investment grade, in part by the conflict, because of the rising pressure it put on public finances, but also because the country was coming from a financial crisis. Oil was on a decline in terms of production. So Colombia managed to turn around the policy of democratic security, successful management of the economy, rising investment. So at least for Fitch ratings, what we came to the conclusion is that while the conflict would remain present, it did not represent a threat to economic activity, it to the improvement in fundamentals of Colombia. Therefore, given where the rating is at the BBB level, which is very high compared to Brazil, Panama, for instance, we do not believe an immediate benefit will materialize. However, if we see that growth increases in its trend, if we see that investment helps support fiscal accounts in the long term, if we see the other fundamentals in terms of competitiveness, in terms of governance improve, you could see eventually a positive factor into the rating. But conversely as well, if for some reason, and I hope that doesn't happen, the peace process doesn't come to a successful ending, it would not have an impact on the rating either.
Which is...
I would add to that the peace dividend, as they call it now in Colombia, peace dividend, will come from the rural areas. What we have already agreed with FARC for rural development is a program that, if you compare that with Central America, would be the same of building a program for a country the size of El Salvador and Honduras together for the next 15 years. It will commit between 1 point and 1.5 points of GDP annually for 15 years. So that's going to be a big locomotive for growth. that comes from the rural territory. That when I say average of 30% of poverty, it means that in the urban areas it's 20, and in the rural areas it's 40 or 38. So a big windfall will come from agribusiness, agriculture, and stability of regions that have been for 60 years in conflict. So I would add to that account the program for rural development.
Okay. And very quickly from Cynthia and the ambassador, any insights on what is happening in the peace process? Because
those are real boundaries.
the government is naturally very reserved on that. And let me tell you, I think that gives people the perception that nothing is happening, which is understandable. But what can you both let us know in what is happening?
Ladies first, great. Well, one of the issues, I think, has been that there has been very little information about the peace process, and I think that was a very explicit decision of the government to not say a lot, precisely to avoid creating a situation where after every negotiating session, people just go to the microphone and make big declarations about what's being discussed. So there has been a real effort, violated, at times on both sides, but an effort to keep what's being discussed very discreet. And that's been very criticized within Colombia, particularly by the media, because they like to have information about what's going on. So it will create difficulties, I think, down the road for the government, given the level of opposition and skepticism and rejection of the FARC, to not have brought people along throughout the process in terms of greater details about what's being discussed. What we do know is that there have been several rounds of discussions now on the third theme of the agenda on drug trafficking, and one can imagine that things like fumigation and the FARC's involvement in drug trafficking, which is quite robust, are on the table, and that there is a question of extradition to the United States for people accused or wanted in the United States for drug trafficking crimes.
Have you been with NSA? You know almost everything about the negotiation.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you just know what is going to be. You mean what the core issues are? Whether people would be extradited on drug trafficking crimes in the way that many leaders of the AUC were in fact extradited during the previous Uribe administration. So those are all very difficult issues. Hard sell in the United States, a particularly hard sell in the US Congress. And I expect that is the number one issue where there will be frictions between the United States and Colombia over the peace process. There's in general been an embrace, an overwhelming political support given by the White House, the State Department, Vice President Biden, and everybody who's gone to Colombia, President Obama himself. But when you get down into the sort of different agencies, the people that have made their careers fighting drugs in Colombia, and it was the issue that defined US-Colombian relations for so many years, I think there's going to be some rough going.
That's a tough one, Ambassador.
There's no doubt. What we are actually currently negotiating Havana is point number 4 of the agenda. Once I said to Cindy, there was no. It's point number 4 in the agenda, but it's the third item we are negotiating. It was not in order. So I said, if you take the 6 points of the agenda, the 2 first, rural development and political reform, were the questions that FARC would put to the Colombian society. What are you going to do with the peasants, with land, with and so on? What are you going to do with the defaults you have or the electoral system? But the other 4 are the questions that the world and the Colombian society are asking FARC. What are you going to do with drug trafficking? Yeah. What are you going to do with your arms, with your victims, with justice, with reparation? So it's a very hard question, the point number 3, because the real question is, in the table, are you going to stop trafficking with drugs? That's the real question. Mm-hmm. So it has some other chapters or some sub-chapters to that question. The first is illicit crops. We can't forget that FARC has been defending substitutionary eradication theoretically since Marulanda was alive. In the process of Caguán, Marulanda personally made an offer for eradication in Cartagena el Chairá. I think many of those proposals of that time will be taken into account. But imagine the impact in world news, to put it in a way, of a press conference in 2 months in Havana where Humberto de la Calle and Iván Márquez go to the journalists and say, we have reached an agreement for a program of cooperation between FARC and the government for 2 years to make Colombia a coca-free country. That's the kind of things we could get from the agreement. Many people say, well, but there's a big amount of FARC members that will not be under the umbrella of the agreement. Yeah, that's true. But the good news is that Mr. Fabián Ramírez, that was the person that was asked to be in Havana by the pessimists, is now there. Is he there to impeach negotiations? I doubt it. Mm-hmm. Well, anything could be with FARC, but I doubt it. He went there really to take the issue of drug trafficking into his hands. He is the one that knows what's going on. So I'm very optimistic with the presence of this person there. He is the guy to be asked about that.
And we all hear about the 2 months, so now we have the...
Yeah, nothing's happening is practically true because we're in the middle of the election. So the FARC think that negotiating before the election is giving up.
So let's try to move on. I don't know how are we going on time, but I would like to talk about post-conflict. That is something that was never a word in our lives, but it is now. In your area, is there a scenario of post-conflict in Colombia, Erich? And I imagine there are costs associated to that. Mm-hmm. There was a fiscal reform approved. Maybe in order to implement the peace, Colombia will need a new fiscal reform.
Correct. I mean, looking at it from a rating perspective, we have talked about the very positive elements of Colombia. However, if you make a comparison with other investment grade countries, especially commodity exporters, where public finances is an area where Colombia, despite improvements with the fiscal rule, doesn't stack up as outstanding. We have a deficit of above 2% of GDP, 2.3, 2.4 this year. And the question is how you close that gap, or even have to face additional spending because of a peace process. Yes. Don't get me wrong, it's of course it's going to be an investment in the country, but some decisions have to be made. I mean, for starters, Colombia's revenue base is small in comparison not only to investment countries, but also for Latin American standards. So the question is how to finance peace without, weakening further fiscal accounts. Mm-hmm. I think that there's an awareness, not only in our public authorities, but also in society, that peace is going to cost. And that's the good news for Colombia. The issue, of course, is try to find the most efficient way and the most sustainable way in which to finance this, and also make the expenditure more efficient.
Mm-hmm. Cynthia, you see Colombia working in the right, taking the right steps for post-conflict, preparing for that scenario?
Well, I would distinguish between post-war and post-conflict. In most countries that have gone through a peace process, there is a great deal of violence in the post-accord era. And I think it would be really a mistake to think that the signing of a peace accord is going to signify, the end of violence in Colombia. There is still a huge amount of violence currently related to the BACRIM, to the organized crime bands, and there will be, just as there are demobilized AUC members that are part of those, there will be demobilized FARC members that continue in these drug trafficking bands. And the violence, as you see in Mexico, as you see in many countries, as part of the competition over ports, access to routes to get the drugs out and weapons in, I mean, it's going to be quite intense. I think there's also the risk of political violence. The targeting of people who demobilize, I don't think that that should be taken lightly, the ability to provide for their security in the post-peace era. I've had people from Colombia, very conservative Colombians say that they will not allow it to happen, that the FARC participates. And and there's kind of a veiled threat as part of that they simply will not allow this to happen, because to allow it to happen turns Colombia into potentially another Venezuela. So, it's seen as an existential threat to the nature of Colombian democracy. I think there's another big issue at stake, which has to do with the ability of the Colombian state to implement all of the different programs that will come about as a result of the peace accord. And if you just look at what's happened with the land restitution process, despite the really historic nature of that legislation and what that initiative meant, including in terms of changing the minds and the perceptions of FARC leaders that this was really a different president that they could sit down with, who was willing to tackle some of these longstanding historical problems. I mean, of the 360,000 claims, the number of claims that have actually been adjudicated and resolved are in several hundred. The number of families that have actually been returned to their land with titles, you can count, on one or two hands. So it's going to take a lot of coordination among different agencies with the legal system. All of the various programs, I think, are going to be a big challenge to get these whole of government approaches. And again, I guess one reason to be optimistic that it can work is if you look at the types of programs that have been implemented between the Colombian government and the armed forces and the consolidation zones, where there's been an attempt to couple the achievement of military security with social services. That is reason to be hopeful. But if you look, on the other hand, at the implementation of the land and ley de víctimas, it's a very sobering kind of picture.
I would start saying something in this house that concerns this house policy. We cannot commit again the mistake we committed, both the United States and Colombia, in the Contadora group, when we thought that signing peace was the end of all the problems and we could go home happily. No, it has been very expensive to having taken that decision. It can't happen in Colombia. Once we sign, international cooperation has to be maintained or even increased in certain aspects. For instance, the basics of justice administration. Imagine the next day of the signature of the agreement in La Julia, Cartagena, and Chaira, you're going to find paramilitaries, FARC members, ELN members, drug traffickers, peasants that have lived there for 60 years, and peasants that come from Pasto thinking that all the problems are going to be solved. You need someone that morning saying, the chicken is yours, the boundaries of your land is this one, you cannot hit your wife, you have to respect, you cannot handle that revolver, and so on. It's going to take a lot of international cooperation to train the people, to have the infrastructure, the connectivity, to make that happen since the first day, I would say. And starting by that, I would say, yes, we are, in some areas, we are already in the post-conflict. I would say in most of the areas of the rural world in Colombia. But you have to start officially the post-conflict. It cannot be something hidden. It has to be public, that everybody is working in the post-conflict, starting by the actors of the conflict, starting by FARC and ELN. So that you can, as I said in my introductory words, you can differentiate what is conflict and what is organized crime, what is common crime, what is little crime. You have to treat that with a strong police policy, if you want. But then you have to be able to deliver the programs. And Colombians, we have had some tradition of having difficulties with delivering. But we have had also very positive experiences. I'm a witness of one of them after the earthquake of '99. We were able to rebuild, you were there, to rebuild an area as big as El Salvador in just 2 years. with huge public investment, with a lot of international cooperation, but with public-private partnership.
Yes.
So things, we have some precedents that could be useful for the post-conflict, but we will need international cooperation in any case. The problems of spending, they are there, but it's going to happen anyway. We have to develop our rural territories with or without agreement with FARC, because there we have 6-7 million Colombians that live in the 19th century. We have to move them to the 21st century. It costs money. There's the room for expenditure, there's no doubt. And the private sector, where I come from the last years, is ready to see any proposals in that respect for the post-conflict. Yeah.
Talking on international cooperation, you just held high-level dialogues in Washington. Let's talk a little bit about the relationship Colombia-US. You said it has evolved. It's not anymore about.
Yes, it was very interesting to have at the same time the Minister of Defense and Foreign Affairs. You are an expert in Colombia. You know that doesn't happen frequently. Well, it happened, and with a very impressive coordination. So that's a mechanism that the US uses with a couple of countries in the world. It's not very common. It implies that the highest levels officials join in a day and take review of the whole bilateral agenda. This time we did things that I didn't think I could see in my lifetime. First, we decided to start a process for a visa waiver for Colombians. Who could have imagined that 5 years ago?
Yeah.
And Mr. Kerry comes to me and says, yes, we have started, there we go. We signed an MOU on energy for exchange in technology, for non-conventional hydrocarbons, for non-conventional electricity, for exploration licensing, socially and environmentally. We also signed an agreement on justice in the areas of conflict with AID, USAID. We signed an education exchange program so that teachers from Colombian universities could come to the US to update knowledge in science, math, so on. We put together the 100,000 strong program of the United States Department of State with some universities in Colombia. By the way, EAFIT won a recognition among the top 5 of Latin America in Antioquia. Are you from EAFIT? Ah, you're so happy for that. Good. So we had tables negotiating or conversation tables on 6 subjects: ocean research, environment, culture, exchange of students in application design, for instance. So it's very impressive how the agenda changed. And in security, Cindy knows that. We moved from being a recipient of security cooperation from the United States to give security cooperation to third countries. We have trained 20,000 public servants in Mexico and Central America in the last 2 years. We will double that in the next 2 years. Judges, policemen, investigators, people that fight against small crimes, small drug trafficking, and so on. So we have received requests of cooperation from Dominican Republic and Costa Rica, and even from West Africa. I think that's a very likely horizon for our military forces in the long run, to become a force that could teach others what we have learned and may become that a capacity to fight joint in coordination against organized crime.
Mention something, because that is really a critical point, and it's, when we think about peace processes, we think about what's going to happen to the guerrilla forces, how are they going to be reintegrated, how they're going to be demobilized and trained to do something other than shoot people. One issue that has been very destabilizing in a number of processes, including in Latin America, most notably El Salvador, is what you do when members of the armed forces, or when the armed forces are reduced in size overall. When you no longer have a war, it is difficult sometimes to maintain the same levels of troops. And so if you are seen, or the government is seen as offering better kinds of benefits to demobilized guerrillas than it is to members of the security forces that are being downsized, that creates a big problem. So I think that there's every likelihood. I mean, there would be, even with the training missions, which I agree are, a fabulous export, and where Colombia has done a lot of good, not just in the Americas, but all over the world. There will be inevitably a reduction in the size of the army, of not so much the police, but the army, and there needs to be really sort of serious thought that goes into how that's managed and with what kind of sort of severance packages.
That's a fair point. I am about to open the floor for questions, but only one very quick question, the same for all of you. Venezuela, because Colombia is inserted in that specific
Talking
place.
about boundaries.
How much affects what is happening in Venezuela to Colombia?
I
If
think
it
that one of the risks for Colombia on the external front was Venezuela. Let's say 2008, when was the second trading partner of Colombia, and the second and received around 40% of manufacturing exports.
Yeah.
And the political relations and the economic realities of Venezuela have reduced that dependency on Venezuela. The situation is fluid in Venezuela politically. From a rating perspective, of course, we believe that at this point politics is limiting the policy maneuverability of the government. We don't see an imminent collapse. I think that the controls, what they strangle the economic activity, also provide some levers of movement for the Maduro administration, and they're trying to use them through the implementation of the SICA-2, or the second parallel exchange mechanism. But exposure of Colombia to Venezuela, at least on the economic side, should be limited.
On the political side, it could be dramatic, because there has been a call for the international community to play a role, an important role, whether through the OAS or UNASUR, in brokering some kind of dialogue in Venezuela. And I think because of the assistance that Venezuela is providing to the peace talks that are underway in Havana, it puts President Santos in a bit of a bind in terms of how far he can be seen as pushing the Maduro government in one way or another. I think in a way it limits the ability of Colombia to play a much more proactive role. And there are probably few countries that stand to lose as much as Colombia does if the instability should become more widespread, or the polarization deepen and become even more violent. Both in terms of refugee flows, the economic impacts, are reduced from what they had been in the past, but they're not negligible. I think there's a great deal at stake, for Colombia, as there is for the whole region, in terms of how, the international community plays a role in helping Venezuela overcome this terrible polarization that's cost several dozen lives already.
Yep.
So you have heard the economic version, the political version. Now you're going to hear the diplomatic version.
Perfect.
But first you have to tell us whether you agree or disagree with the
No way.
Exactly,
no way,
exactly.
no way.
Well done.
I think whatever happens in Venezuela concerns Colombia. Yeah, there's no doubt about that. Our foreign minister has said that anything we could do to help dialogue move on in Venezuela, we are ready to do that. Inside UNASUR, inside of the OAS, with the group that the government could
and Colombia is doing it.
Colombia is, as we speak, our foreign minister is in Caracas, in the group of UNASUR. The announcement of the nomination of a new ambassador of Venezuela in Washington, I think, will bring some news to the bilateral relation between that country and the United States. So we're very interested in having a neighbor that can live peacefully. We are very thankful to the Venezuelan government for their support to our peace talks. President Chavez especially was key for starting the negotiations. President Maduro has been also very efficient when the process in Havana has had tough moments. Don't forget that Cuba and Norway are really the facilitators in Venezuela, and Chile are the company countries for the process. So we would like to see in the short term initiatives from the government of Venezuela to call to new dialogue and to deal peacefully with the controversy inside.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Okay, I think we are ready to open the floor for questions. Yes, please identify yourselves and let us know if you want to address a question to one specific speaker.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. First of all, I really appreciate you guys all being here. Great conversation. My name is Daniel Arce, an AS member, young professional, vice president of Alpha New York, and Merrill Lynch financial advisor. We had a great discussion on the geopolitical situation in Colombia. Very positive conversation. I'm really happy to sit here as a Colombian in the audience and hear the progression of our country. I didn't hear so much on the financial markets, and I guess this question might be for Erich, but please, anybody, feel free to participate. How has Mila affected? Has it disappointed? Has it evolved? Is Mila something that's going to allow Colombia to be a powerhouse in international trade, in the international trading community, or do we still have to take a backseat to Mexico and Brazil for years to come? And if there is progress on the trading front, on the primary and secondary markets there, is there an opportunity for Colombia to one day remove themselves from Mila and operate under their own accord?
Well, regarding Mila, I would say it's a work in progress. I think that it's a natural that the integration of three platforms or three stock markets would take time. And I think that that's coinciding with a time where probably the liquidity conditions are not as favorable, especially from international investors' point of view, as they were in, let's say, 2012. However, I think that there's promise there. I believe that as we have a world that increases uncertainty and returns to pricing risk, differentiating among countries with different fundamentals, you could see some potential development there in the integration of three of the most vibrant economies, market-friendly economies with solid fundamentals really helps. Now, Mexico doesn't necessarily represent a competition to Colombia because, as you are aware, there's also the Alianza del Pacífico process. And there's also the potential for Mexico to participate in a Mila or enhanced Mila. So I would say that it's an issue of regulation, it's an issue of operations. It will take time, but it's not, with no doubt, a positive alternative, not only for the local Colombian market, but for the fact of the region.
Hi, thank you. My question touches on something that was not talked about, which is trade agreements. Because you mentioned industrial sector, and it was not really talked about. And I'm an anthropologist, and what I see at the local level is, and one of the amazing things about Colombia is the incredible leatherware and the knitwears, by the way. You guys have an amazing production that is totally being annihilated by lo que se llama producto chino, no? When I interview the people, everybody's very scared of all of the sudden, all of these shoes, products. So my question goes back to not only the effects of the trade agreements that are already affecting unemployment and the local industry, but also the pending new trade agreements. My question is whether there's anything on the works to protect the local industry, to ensure that Colombia doesn't just become a country of consumers, but actually can maintain a very vibrant industrial sector.
Yeah, the paradox, madam, is that the only country we don't have an FTA with is China. So the menace of China is there because of their own merits. China has been an engine of manufacturing for the last 20 years, and it remains so for a long run in the future. It's becoming more expensive, China. They are taking now measures on the currency. They are paying better workers, and so the competition with China will be in more loyal terms than they were before. So the invasion of China products was true until 2010 or 11. It has dramatically changed in Latin America. Consumer, as the consumer moves up in income, chooses better other sources of supply than China because of quality, because of fashion, because of easy acceptance. And you put the example of two items that have flourished with the FTA with the United States, apparel and textile. Those two have grown at 8% in the last 2 years. With the United States, it has happened, and the figures are there. But of course, competition is what is this all about, is that you can improve your competitiveness as enterprise, as corporation, as a person, as a country, with the new instruments, accessing to better markets. So no, I'm still the very explicit defender of the FTAs. They have brought growth to our economy, and growth, if you use it well in good government, it brings prosperity for people. Yeah.
Could I comment on that just briefly?
Of course, yes.
Let me just preface it by saying my comment by saying that I also am a defender of the Colombia-U.S. FTA, but I think it's actually been a much better deal for U.S. businesses than for Colombians, and I think that that's a pretty widespread, view in Colombia, because the majority of Colombian exports, and it's a little bit difficult to take issue with the former president of the Industrialists Association, but I think that the majority of Colombian exports to the United States are still commodities: coal, oil, gold, coffee, and the United States is sending farm equipment and all that kind of stuff. So that when you look at the overall sort of numbers of how much trade has gone up between the United States and Colombia since the signing of the FTA, or by the time of the first anniversary, now already almost a year ago, we're almost up to 2 years, the volume of trade has gone way up, but the sort of amount of Colombian exports coming to the United States have gone up by itsy-bitsy amounts, and the amount of U.S. exports going to Colombia have gone up quite dramatically. So, maybe my numbers are a little bit out of date, but I do think that there's a little bit of sort of imbalance that needs to be addressed, and certainly is, in certain aspects, is to be expected at the beginning. And hopefully, Colombia will be able to use the FTA with the greater ease of investment and all that kind of thing to create manufacturing platforms in Colombia, and that other countries will see Colombia as an attractive place to invest, so that they can also have access to the U.S. market. So there are all kinds of things that could happen down the road.
No, but I think we shouldn't move that fast from this item, because I have the figures here as of January. So I see, for instance, that apparel and clothing, not knitted or crocheted articles, grew 13% in the month of January. These are United States figures, not mine. Aluminium articles, 50%. Miscellaneous, what else I had here? Well, and the exports from the United States to Colombia. Cereals. It means that we are buying wheat 25% cheaper than the one we were buying from Argentina. Was that bad news? I don't think so. That's good for Colombian families to have access to cereals cheaper than the ones we're buying with high duties from Argentina. So figures are there, but it's not only trade, it's also investment. We closed last year with $17 billion in foreign direct investment. Half of that is oil and mining, but the other half is manufacturing, agribusiness, financial system, transportation, communications, infrastructure. So no, I really think the figures of free trade justify very explicitly what we have done there.
I think
I'm
Erich
sorry I
had a comment.
interrupted you.
No, no problem. Just wanted to add three dimensions more to the topic because it's a complicated matter. First of all, many times the items that are competing with local industry, not only in Colombia but in the broad Latin America, are result of smuggling. So sometimes there's a benefit in having institutional trade links with a country such as China or other Asian economies, in which actually you can regulate sometimes the type of industries you want to protect and the type of exports they are allowed to do into your country. The other item is that from the point of view of competitiveness, we have to take into account that other economies in Latin America have a very vibrant trade agreement agenda. So if you look from the point of view of the entrepreneur, without trade agreements, with the challenges they bring, and those challenges are real, it's being left in a very uncompetitive position because Peruvians, Chileans can export without duties. And the final point is the issue of competitiveness itself. Many times they cannot compete or lower the prices or lose against, let's say, other type of manufacturing because there is some lag in the development of policies at the level of how to reduce those costs for entrepreneurs, how to make financing more available to small and medium enterprises. And those are factors where the government, yes, has a responsibility, not to avoid signing trade agreements, but probably move a little bit faster on that agenda.
Very good. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Maybe the gentleman on the back.
Thank you. My name is Jim Perez. I was struck by the comment earlier about the Gallup poll that was released in March that showed a high degree of pessimism. And I was trying to reconcile that with the recent Telefonica Millennium survey, which was presented here just a few months ago. And if I recall correctly, Colombia came out to be number 1 and number 2 in optimism and positive outlook in the Western Hemisphere. I'm trying to reconcile those two. And in part, I guess you touched on it when you discussed Venezuela. Perhaps the current pessimism that the Gallup poll showed reflects more what's going on in its neighbors with Brazil and Argentina and certainly Venezuela, and not so much what's going on with Colombia itself, because you pointed out the economy itself is doing quite well. Can you help me reconcile that?
I'm not sure that I can, but I'd be happy to, if you share your email, I'd be happy to send you a copy of the poll. I mean, the question was, about, I think they put it in terms of, expectations about the future, and the number of people who said that Colombia, was va por mal camino, was, going in a bad direction, has steadily grown over the last 6 months and is a firm majority, of the public. Now, you could say there are sampling errors. You could say that it was, too loaded to major cities, that they didn't talk to enough people, whatever. But, Gallup is a pretty credible polling firm, and I'm not familiar with the other study that you mentioned, but I'd be more than happy to share.
Here just a few months ago in this room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you're right in the sense that that answer has had very volatile. That question has had very volatile answers in Colombia. If you put a period of 10 years, you have moved to up and downs. But putting some humor to your question, there was this question of Latino Barometro, of who's the happiest society in the world. And that's Colombia. We win that first prize year after year. Who are the happiest citizens in the world? The Colombians. So pessimism and happiness, that's a good mixture. I don't dislike that.
Okay, one more question. Yeah, here. Oh, back there.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's related to the peace process also, and on the cost of the peace process in the economic and the political cost. So in the economic, you already mentioned the 1% to 1.5% of GDP. Is there like a
Per year.
per year? Is that, how do you square that with the fiscal rule that Erich was talking about? And also on the political, how far do you think the Colombian society is willing to give for the peace process? And just as a ñapa, what if after you show us this package, the society says no?
I would say let's assume that there's a peace agreement and everything goes fluently to the future. There's room for additional expenditure in Colombia. There's no doubt. I think, Erich, you would agree with me. We have very low levels of debt. We have capacity for indebtedness in the domestic market. We have open sources in the international multilateral banks that we have not been using for the last 15 years. So there are the sources that will not affect a good behavior because we are having growing fiscal income. So we are in a trend for the next, I would say, decade because of oil and coal production and the new reserves we have found in other minerals and metals. That basic income for the fiscal finances will be there. So that's not the question that really worries me. It won't affect, I think, our investment grade or so. The real question is not if the Colombian side is ready to pay for the peace. No. It's not the first one. The first one is, are we ready to reconcile between ourselves? That's the real question. It's not a question of reconciling among the majorities that we are already fighting too much for my taste. Mm-hmm. It's reconciling with those that are coming from outside the system and the dangers that Cynthia was mentioning. Is going to be safe to do politics in Colombia for everybody? Are victims going to be asked for pardon? Are they going to be reparated? Given reparation? We have reintegrated 55,000 Colombians that were combatants. Let's assume that 20,000 more will show up with the peace process. We are ready to do that. Is the society ready to receive them? That's the question. Real peace will come not when we are ready to pay for peace, but to feel that we can reconcile with the one that is coming from outside the system. And it's going to take a generation at least.
Is the private sector ready?
Yes, we have a tradition of that. The private sector, differently from Central America, didn't show up in the peace processes at the last minute. We have always been there since the beginning, since President Betancourt attempts to reach peace. And it's not because of lack of generosity of the private sector in Colombia that we will not have peace.
Excellent. Okay. I'm afraid we have run out of time. I really want to thank the Colombian Ambassador Luis Carlos Villegas, Cynthia Arnson from the Wilson Center, and Erich Arispe from Fitch Ratings. They were wonderful panelists, and thank you so much for the audience.